Well, hi everyone. Thank you for coming to yet another episode of Cube by Example Insider, where we try to interview people who are kind of doing the work in the Kubernetes space. The big reason, or my big argument for the show, is that unlike many other kind of proprietary products, if you want to know what's going on in open source, if you ask product management, that is often flawed, as we used to say. You don't always get the pizza that you requested, because the challenge with open source is that people can, randomly contribute on nights and weekends to get the features they want into the system. So if we talk to the people who are doing the work, then we can say, hey, what are you seeing as the things that are coming up soon? And today we're going to focus on the OCI, and we'll talk more about what that is and everything in a few minutes. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce our guest, Phil Estes, and we may have another surprise guest in a bit. But Phil, do you want to introduce yourself? And actually, before we do that, let me just say my co-host Savita. Sorry, I forgot to introduce you. And she'll introduce herself and then maybe hand it to Phil.
Sounds good. Thank you, Langdon. Hi, everyone. My name is Savita, and I am a Red Hatter for the past 3 years almost. It's coming up. And I've been contributing to Kubernetes community for the past 5 or 6 years. I started with documentation, and then I did a bit of release. I was with the release team for 5 releases, and then I found my home with SIG security. So that's where I am right now contributing. And if you want to find me, you can find me in those channels. And I'm also a maintainer for the Conveyor project, which is also a CNCF sandbox project that focuses on application modernization. I think it's enough about me. Now I'm going to pass it on to our guest, Phil.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Phil Estes. I'm a principal engineer at AWS, but more importantly for the show, I've been a longtime contributor to the container runtime part of the stack. So a decade ago, for anyone that was at KubeCon, there were a lot of 10-year references, 10 years of Kubernetes. Solomon Hykes talked about 10 years ago building Docker. A decade ago, got very involved in the Docker runtime project. At the time was at IBM, collaborated a ton with Red Hat folks on the super early days of Docker, and then helping launch the OCI and all the work that I think we'll probably talk about here. And more recently, or at least in that same time frame, we launched Containerd as a sort of vendor neutral, just core runtime that was donated to the CNCF 7 years ago now. Actually 7 years ago this month, and have been a maintainer on that project for the last 7 years and watched it grow, and that's sort of my entry point into Kubernetes, because Containerd became a popular choice for the runtime underneath Kubernetes. I always feel weird when people invite me to Kubernetes things, because I'm not an actual contributor or member of the org, but I'm adjacent to Kubernetes and work a lot with the Kubernetes team. So yeah, that's me.
That's cool. I'll say it was completely planned that it was 7 years ago this month. That's why we invited you on the show. Let me ask you first, before we kind of get really into OCI, one of the things we like to ask our guests is, kind of what got you into open source in the first place? How did you get pulled into that space?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll try and make it brief given my age. But I super early in my IBM career, so graduated college, joined IBM, worked on proprietary operating system software, way down in the bowels of IBM. Doing nothing with customers, just coding, and just curious about a lot of things. And this new operating system, Linux, started showing up, and the internet was kind of new, and so finding information on things was not as easy. But I was taking a master's level course and needed a compiler, and it was super painful to think about buying a compiler just to do the work for this course. Long story short, I was like, this Linux thing is super easy. You download diskettes, install it, you've got free GCC, and I can do all the homework. So that kind of got me hooked in general on the concepts around open source software. But it was a very long time before I actually contributed. I ended up working for a good while in IBM's Linux Technology Center, which had a ton of collaboration with Red Hat long before the purchase. So I was sort of in the realm of open source, using open source, but it really wasn't till 2013 that I kind of switched roles in IBM, joined the cloud unit that had been looking at PaaSes and all this sort of exciting new world of cloud technology. And that happened to be the year that Docker became extremely popular. And IBM said, we need some people to just go figure out this community, go get involved, see what this whole thing's about. And that's when I really just dove in, because I, created a GitHub account and figured out, how to create a PR and fix a bug. And I just loved it. Like it just radically changed the trajectory of my career at that point. Became a maintainer within a year plus, and got, just very involved in contribution and trying to help figure out, we all know how communities are. They're just slight bit of chaos mixed with some bit of organization. But I loved it. I loved the environment. And so that's really when I got hooked.
It was funny when you were saying that about kind of the early days of the internet. I still tell students sometimes, oh yeah, back in the day we used to guess websites, because things like Yahoo didn't even exist, and so the only way you could, find a website was by guessing the name of it. So it's been a big change, right, over the years.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. I also remember, kind of getting Slackware on floppy disks and installing it in the late 90s. In a stack of 16, as I recall, floppy disks to get the operating system installed. And you got to make sure that you set your monitor settings correctly. Otherwise, you could literally light it on fire. Yeah, fun times. So that's cool. It's interesting because I think a lot of the people we normally interview on the show, right, kind of got into open source mostly because they were trying to like scratch their own itch, right? And it sounds to me more like you were almost like kind of going and trying to almost like build a product, right, or try to go and like there was a need in this space rather than necessarily something kind of personal that is what brought you there. Does that seem like
Yeah, I think that's fair. So yeah, I mean, like I said, I was in the realm, and so people knew, oh, Phil knows Linux. He's been kind of on the edges of that community. But yeah, it was essentially a part of my job that I was asked to go, sort of investigate this new technology.
right.
And the cool thing is, like, I had always worked kind of at the operating system level. And so coming to Docker and realizing that everything they were doing is really built on Linux kernel capabilities, the namespaces and C groups and all, it was a good, all of us, I assume at some point in your career, you've had a job where it's like you've kind of learned to turn the crank, and that's the kind of role I'd been in just before that. And so it was, like I said, it really did change the trajectory of my career, because out of that came a ton of learning and digging in, at a deeper level than I had. And then, from there, actually figuring out, hey, that it'd be fun to start sharing this. And so I started speaking at conferences, and that launched a whole aspect of my career that had never existed. So, but yeah, it all came out of like sort of almost like a job, like go check this out.
Right. So kind of changing gears a little bit. So I mentioned OCI at the beginning, right? It's the Open Container Initiative. I can't remember what the so I think it would be really awesome if you could kind of explain what the OCI is and how it relates to Containerd or Docker or like Podman, or because I think it's something that's quite confusing for many people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things with a pretty interesting origin story. Again, to make a KubeCon reference, there was a keynote, I think on Friday, Bob Wise, who I think was at Samsung's cloud at the time, but joined AWS later. gave some hints at that story. But the essential parts of the story are that, and this is super interesting, that I happened to get involved in a project that immediately ended up in lots of controversy, because that was an additional twist on all of it. It wasn't just working on Docker, the runtime. It was all of a sudden there was, CoreOS came out with Rocket and said, hey, we think Docker is going in kind of the wrong direction. There should be a spec. There should be a definition of what a container is. And Docker shouldn't be in charge of sort of defining kind of how containers work. I think Red Hat was going through a transition with re-architecting OpenShift around containers, using the Docker engine initially, but then clashing around, low-level debates around should systemd be a primary part of how containers work, and Docker saying absolutely not. We think they're just application containers. So yeah, out of all this swirling controversy, large entities like Google and Microsoft and IBM, and including Red Hat, were pretty worried about the future of what a rift in kind of this very early technology would bring to the industry. And so there were essentially some meetings, and Bob in his keynote talked about, a specific meeting with Dan Cohn involved, that both launched, I think it was the same summer of 2015, within a few months. The CNCF was launched to take over kind of Kubernetes, to shepherd the Kubernetes project, and the OCI was formed to say, hey, CoreOS, Docker, Red Hat, whoever else has ideas, like, let's get together under a consortium, similar to the CNCF, run by the Linux Foundation, and let's hash out specifications, like for what a container is, what a container image is. And so the OCI had a very, symbiotic relationship with the CNCF. CNCF was Kubernetes, the code. OCI was, here's the standards that if you want your own container runtime, or you don't want to use Docker, like, at least conform to these specs so we can all interoperate. And so that's really how the OCI was launched.
Right, and I actually remember that, because it was like two really big kind of splashes, right?
Yeah,
the CNCF and then the OCI, and so I think it's important to note, right, that the OCI isn't really software kind of in and of itself, right? It's more like, an RFC or something like that, where, and I think that's where it gets a little bit confusing. Plus the fact that there's actually, isn't there an OCID? So, and then, so how does that relate to like container D, for example?
No, good question. And so there is, the OCI is imperfect in that it's not just a pure standards body. At the same moment of its founding, there was also the decision for Docker to give the core, what had been called libcontainer, a subdirectory within the Docker project that really did the work of starting a container process on Linux. They donated that to the OCI to be the first reference implementation of the runtime spec. So runC was that new software project that would be collaborated alongside the spec, so that there'd be a place to, if you're going to build a higher layer container runtime, whether it's Podman or Docker continuing along their path, or Creo that came out, or Containerd, essentially there'd be a reference that you could use. And so runC has been a broadly used piece of software, and that became clear when we had a huge CVE in January of this year, that it's just amazing how much runC is probably on every Linux server in the world, and when it needs to be patched, it's a big deal. So runC is that initial implementation. So Containerd, Docker, Creo, Podman, they all conform to the OCI spec, mostly by using runC, and there are other implementations of the spec. So Red Hat created crun, which is written in C, that operates just like runC, has some other capabilities that were important to Red Hat. But runC is sort of a de facto standard that goes alongside the spec. And so all the tools and all the, when you build a container, when you run it in OpenShift or Amazon's cloud or Google, the fact that the OCI specs exist and we all happen to either depend on the same binary implementation or have a conformant implementation, and then you expand that out to our registries, whether Quay or a commercial registry or one of the big cloud providers registries. We've all agreed like how we transfer container images and what they look like, and so the specs have given us that level playing field that whether you use Containerd or Creo or Podman or Docker, the common world that we wanted to create essentially exists because we can all interoperate.
Yeah, I think the one where I was kind of like most impressed by the kind of proliferation of the standard was actually like on Flatpak, because it's like Flatpak are containers, right? But they're like wildly different, right? than kind of what you normally think of as containers, and yet it at least to the best of my knowledge, conforms to the OCI as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really it's kind of impressive for the standard to be able to be used in those kind of two wildly different scenarios, even though mostly applications still, but still a GUI application and a command line application are quite different in a lot of ways, right? Let's see, what was I going to talk about next? So at present, you are primarily working on Containerd, or are you mostly working in kind of the standard space, or both? Or?
Yeah, so both, although I would say I'm more technically involved in Containerd, the project, and its life cycle of releases. And one of the cool things joining AWS, one of my interests was really building, not just myself working upstream, but AWS had built a container runtime team that was learning to sort of contribute upstream and take leadership roles, become maintainers. And so a lot of the last 3 years has not just been me working in the project, but mentoring and helping, this AWS team learn how to be more involved in open source, learn how to contribute, because Containerd is used broadly in AWS services that offer container compute primitives like our Kubernetes offering or Fargate. So yeah, that's I'd say my day job is very focused on that. I'm a member of the OCI Technical Oversight Board, and I've been on that for a number of years. But that's really, an oversight role that the maintainers of each spec are actually doing the day-to-day work of new spec releases, changes, resolving, requests for new ideas to be added to the spec. But yeah, so I'm still involved in the OCI, but there are others who carry on a lot of the day-to-day work.
I got you.
Yeah, that brings me to the question that I have had in my mind. So when Phil started talking, you mentioned about the community, right? And we have a lot of stakeholders who are interested in who are contributing, who wants to be like have a say in the OCI spec, and you can even call the situation like a too many quick the kind of situation. So how do you deal with the enhancements that comes through? Like, what is the process? Or like, I know the heart of the open source is like transparency. It's a part of Linux Foundation, but can you shed a little bit more light into it so that viewers can know how they can get involved in case if they are interested in this? It's probably documented somewhere, but it would be amazing to hear from one of the maintainers and who is on the technical oversight committee. If I got that wrong, if I got that right.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I will say that the OCI has struggled to it's not the same as like an open source project where people just come in and you can do a quick PR and sort of get yourself established as a contributor. Specifications for decades have been painful work because there's just lots of opinions, and by nature you want specs to move slowly because people, you end up with so many projects that conform to a spec that, if you add a new feature in a revision of the spec that says it's a required feature, now you may have forced hundreds of projects to figure out how to add that new feature to their software to say they're still conformant to the spec. So I'd say the first 2 years of the OCI were fairly straightforward because it was mostly about, like, Docker is kind of a de facto standard. They've already defined like what an image looks like. And it was mostly, small debates about, what should we name this property? Docker named it this. Do we still want to name it that? So getting to that first 1.0 OCI spec was fairly straightforward. Since then, the OCI has, I think, had to learn a lot about what it means to, invite people to bring new ideas and yet help them see, like, how we can do that in a way that's not painful for adopters of the spec. And so we just released the OCI 1.1 image spec and distribution spec in the last month or so. We thought we were going to release that last January. So as you can see, that was painful for people that were like, I'm ready for the 1.1 spec. Like, I think this is what we want. Like, we need it. And then it took another year. And most of that was allowing people who had strong opinions to not hold it up, but to make sure we fully understood why they were resisting, like, a certain language of, something being a must or a should for those that know spec language. Those seem like super small things, but, like, that once you release and people start adopting it, like, it's really hard to change that. And so, so spec work is a little bit more like sort of grinded out, a little more pain involved of, like, you can't just cut a release every 3 months and say, hey, okay, floodgates are now open for new features. So yeah, it's a lot of, like, trying to be super intentional with people and help them understand. And, we've had people come, with in the early days, like, Sun and Solaris was still around. So, containers aren't just about Linux. So the Windows people were there, Solaris people were there, and now FreeBSD people have come and gotten their pieces added. So I think we're open. I think the OCI is appropriately open to new ideas and making sure we cover, all the use cases that people care about. But yeah, it can be tricky because it's not an easy thing just to, for example, one final example before I stop rambling about specs, but there's a lot of we've had, like I said, we've had containers for about 10 years at least. Popularly, the pieces of that have been around much longer, but and a lot of folks have come and said, the way we store images and you've got these layers and they're all tar balls and they're compressed and you unpack them and layer them. That was great. That was a great initial idea, but, like, here's a bunch of ways that's slow or that lacks performance characteristics that we could have if we redid it. But think about, like, all the registries in the world, all the containers that have been built. Like, you can't just sort of say, well, tomorrow we're all going to do OCI 2.0 and images look totally different and they're better, so just, switch today. Like, that there'll be if we ever get there, there'll be a huge period of overlap and people trying to transition to a new world of whatever OCI 2.0 looks like. So that's maybe a good example of, like, specs are there's this huge tension involved with conformance versus new features, new ideas.
And if you are looking for a new, like, fun April 1st prank, you can always say, like, hey, 2.0 is coming.
Exactly.
You can just unrelease the chaos.
Yeah.
You're right.
You just have to rebuild everything. It'll be totally fine. I did share, though, you can still have fun with specs because I threw in the chat the TCP/IP over carrier,
Oh
carrier. Always a good one. So although I just something you said made me think of something else. So or is there a movement or discussion or something of BSD jails, for example, conforming to OCI, like some of the other Unix-like platforms and their interpretations of containers?
So there has been talk of that. I don't keep up as much with the runtime spec because again, it's probably the slowest moving at this point because it's very stable, it's very well understood. It's mostly kernel features that appear in the Linux kernel that would be valuable, say from a security context. The runtime spec will add a way to in your containers config to turn on that kernel feature. And so most of the runtime spec work is kind of the slow movement of new capabilities up through the stack. But yeah, I mean, the lightweight hypervisor folks have been around the OCI for a while. We just had a discussion. We had some meeting time in Paris last week for folks to join and talk about OCI work. And this whole idea about using sandboxes, like a more generic term, a sandbox could be a group of Linux containers like a pod in Kubernetes, but it could be a VM. And so thinking about, I don't just want a spec that tells me how containers start. I want a spec that encapsulates like the start of a sandbox, because that may have network and storage and starting a VM and knowing all the configurations about memory and a kernel to boot that VM. And so, confidential containers is, one of those use cases. So yeah, the OCI is having to understand all these worlds where people are using container concepts, but maybe in ways that the original, Docker run container doesn't encapsulate fully. And so, I think we will see the OCI grow to kind of, whether it's additional specs like, oh, here's the sandbox spec, and it knows how to run container specs. Those kind of ideas. The OCI will have to adopt and understand those use cases and figure out what that means to the specs.
Interesting. Spec work is, I think one of the other things, there's a lot of, it's not politicking necessarily in the bad sense of the term, as much as there's a lot of kind of negotiation and discussion and whatever about kind of each of those pieces, because as you kind of said, it's really long running, and has a pretty strong impact on a lot more people than just the people making the spec,
Right.
So kind of talking a little bit more about Containerd. So what is Containerd doing exactly? Like what is its job?
Yeah. So like I said, initially it came out of Docker and some of those early sort of contentious debates about, Kubernetes needs a container runtime. It had been using Docker for years. Docker at the moment was, adding things like Swarm, which is like, sort of swatting in the face of Kubernetes. Like, hey, we have our own orchestrator built in the binary that you're using to run containers under Kubernetes. And it wasn't just that. It was, Docker was moving very fast. Kubernetes was moving very fast. And so Docker was breaking Kubernetes releases and vice versa. So Containerd was meant to be the stable core. It didn't have all the features of Docker. It just had the features that the kubelet needed to drive, like pull an image, start a container, start a pod. And so we haven't even talked about, I guess we haven't mentioned the term CRI. I don't know, the audience should definitely be aware of that, but the container runtime interface was a new API created from the kubelet to call into a container runtime. And it kind of disconnected what had been a very tightly coupled system of kubelet and Docker engine. through a piece of code called the Docker shim, which was finally deprecated just now I guess maybe
like 2
over
years
a
ago.
year ago.
I was actually going to mention that I can't remember if it was this show or the other show I did, where we actually did an episode all about the removal of Dr. Jim, and how it wasn't actually that big a deal, but it kind of was.
Right. It kind of ended a whole era and made sure that the CRI now is the only real way to connect up Kubernetes to a container runtime. And so Containerd implemented that interface from Kubernetes and had a simple set of services, like I know how to pull an image, I know how to start a container, I know how to get a container's metrics, and all the things about managing a containerized process. And so Containerd, for most of its life has just simply been hopefully a very stable API, a stable runtime that anyone can use. Kubernetes obviously uses it through the CRI. Docker basically abstracted some of its core kind of inner workings to use Containerd instead of its own code, and that work even is continuing today. So Docker, in essence, is getting smaller and using more of Containerd over the years. So yeah, like I said, we've existed for over 7 years now, and I'd say we're not the most exciting project because our core mission is to be stable, secure, reliable as a runtime, and the needs of a runtime, have been fairly stable over that time period. Our basic ongoing work is the CRI isn't static. It adds new APIs now and then. There have been a couple just in the last Kubernetes release. So we, add features that continue to make the CRI viable for Containerd. And then secondly, any code base just goes through evolutions. We've been refining it. We're just now coming up to our 2.0 release, which lets us finish the deprecation of a lot of things that were done in the early days that we realized, that's not the best way to do it, or here's a better way. So 2.0 has been kind of our focus of the last year, and we're now in the release candidate cycle of that. So yeah, that's mostly what Containerd is up to. The cool thing is we have a huge, broad community. So in the early days, there were some concerns that, Containerd is just another Docker project. But today we have maintainers from every major cloud provider. We've got independents. We have, I think 12 to 15 maintainers, and only 2 or 3 of them work at the same company. So healthy in the sense of like, I'm happy to see kind of our governance is working. We've got, broad interest in the project from a lot of different companies. So yeah, I think we're in a really good spot.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Sorry,
Yeah.
Sweetha, go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt. So that's amazing and wonderful. I wanted to ask one other question. So you have been in the space for a really long time. So if someone wants to get started with containers, they want to learn and they want to eventually contribute to the space, where can they get started, what they can do, and how can they get to their, if they want to give back to the open source community or get involved? It's like being a part of the open source community, knowing how to work in public is one of the important things in every step of like even all the companies, the careers, people are looking like, do you know how to collaborate outside in public?
Yeah. So yeah, containers is kind of a broad space. So there's a lot of potential places, and I do get asked this a good bit. Even people at Amazon, hey, where do I start? Like where do I even figure out what to get involved in? I usually tell people to start by like finding out where a project hangs out, and that sounds kind of weird, but like, is there a Slack?
I say the same thing.
Yeah, like, is there a Slack channel? Because I fear that a lot of people just go to GitHub, and you're just staring at that list of issues or pull requests. You don't know anybody. You don't really, Yeah, I just feel like that's a really tough way to try and get involved as sort of a transactional, like I'm creating an issue, now I'm creating a PR, and I've never like interacted with someone. So I really try and encourage people, if that project has a community call, like join it, just listen in. You may not have anything to share, but you'll start to understand like, oh, she's always, talking about this aspect of the project, and that's what I'm interested in. I should go connect with her. Or he seems to be like the key voice of the project. Like I should figure out how to maybe ask him what they're looking for people to work on. And so, that's what I did a decade ago in the Docker project. Like I learned who the maintainers were and kind of what their unique, like, oh, that seems to be a build person. And like, if I want to learn how to build containers, like, or how the build process works, like I should talk to them. So there's that aspect, like learning about the community you're interested in and figuring out who's who. The second thing is like find out if they have a process for getting involved. Like, do they mark like good first issues or beginner issues? And we do that with our container runtime team here at AWS. We try and like curate, like we actually have an open source block once a week, and it's like just join this call, and here's like a shared doc with like 10 issues we saw that might be easy to start with. And you mentioned, you started with documentation a long time ago. That's a great spot. Like anyone who's gone to an open source project, that the docs are always like painfully, or tend to be like, oh wow, they're still recommending that to start building the project, you install Go version 1.x, and that's like 5 years old. So I bet they don't really mean that. And things like that, like just making it easier for developers to get started. Usually, as a new contributor, you have the best view of like, wow, your docs really didn't help me in this spot. Like I felt like you assumed I knew something that I didn't. Like you're a great person to be able to notice that, because people that are involved are like, they just like have all these assumptions in their head because they've been doing it. So yeah, those are a couple of the main ways that I try and help people get involved. Some projects are better than others, and Containerd, we've tried to get better at like marking issues with like experience levels. But as we all know, like those things take time, and you need to like encourage your maintainer and reviewer community to try and help new contributors in that way.
It was interesting, right? Like, so for a long time now, actually, when I've ever had teams who reported to me, anybody who's new to the team gets to update all the onboarding docs, right? Like, so that's part of the onboarding process. It kind of forces you to really read it carefully, as well as then, contribute back kind of all the changes. And so I think it's a really good kind of model to encourage. I think it works really well.
And the thing is that it's not overwhelming, to be honest. So if someone is new, they would learn how to create a PR, and you're going to work in public. You're like, so there might not be 1,000 eyes on you, but the feel when you start doing it out, like everyone's going to look at my PR, or like it's out in the open, that there is this feeling, like, what are they going to think? So starting something small like onboarding docs or documentation is the easiest thing, that you get to know the project, you get to know the process, and there's like success. Oh, I have successfully done something and I updated it. Now I can just get the motivation you need, and you can just grow from there. That's what happened to me. And I think like so many people might relate to that they started somewhere like in a documentation or something small. And
Yeah, I have to remind people, especially younger engineers that join Amazon and want to work on containers, like I also had that first PR moment. Like I was sweating bullets, like, and this is just 10 years ago. I've been a software developer for 20 years at that point. And somehow it being public, and I know all the maintainers are staring at it, and like I was like refreshing GitHub, like, oh, I hope they're not like, I didn't do something really stupid, or like, because I'd seen maintainers who are like more direct, like, say, oh, this is awful, like you should have done it this way, which isn't great, but like some people are like that. I try and be a little bit gentler, but so I was waiting for that moment myself, like, oh, you did this all wrong, and it was exhilarating to get that LGTM and like wow, it's merged. Like they actually thought it was good. But yeah, everyone has to like get through that kind of initial hurdle of it being public and everyone looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be kind of terrifying. And although I am impressed that was it your first one that was accepted, because I think that's also something to kind of keep in mind, is that your first one may not be accepted. It
Yeah, no,
might be
absolutely.
5 in or so.
Yeah.
But yeah, but let me changing topics a little bit, just because we're getting close to the end of the time. So one of the things I thought was really cool at KubeCon EU last week was one of the keynotes was interviewing kind of a lot of the like TOC about what they think is going to be, what's going to be new or what's going to be still around in 10 years. So I'm going to put the question to you: is what do you think is going to be unchanged, and or what's going to be different in 10 years?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You alluded to it earlier, and I think the fact that like even other, I don't want to say aspects of the industry, I'm not sure the best way to term it, but things that aren't traditionally like run with a container runtime have adopted the OCI like format of how to distribute software. And so like Homebrew, I think, is using OCI images now.
Oh,
There's some
interesting.
GitHub feature that people noticed was transferring things like using the registry protocol and OCI image format. So obviously there's something in that protocol and format that is valuable enough that other people are saying, hey, like why would I create my own format for like sort of moving bits around of software? This really works, or this fits my model. So I feel like, given that, I feel like kind of the core of the OCI model and the core of how those initial container concepts of sharing software around probably has some good staying power. Now, there have been other technologies that have come and gone, and so who knows, life can change quickly. But I feel like we've come upon something that just turns out to be really valuable, and I think that could stick around for a while. What I think may vastly change is we're already seeing inklings of it with WASM, and obviously AI is bringing, everyone's adding AI to everything. How that will change like the idea of how we run things. Containers are one very specific concept about running a process isolated in a certain way, but WASM is already bringing new ideas to that. And the cool thing is, there was I don't know if you saw the WASM keynote, was using Containerd, but plugging in their own shim interface. So it's not using runc, the program I talked about, which knows how to start a container. It uses a WASM executor that knows how to start a WASM process. And so I think this idea of pluggability is what we're going to see explode, is that, people that care about the, confidential, trusted execution environments that some of the chip makers are coming up with are going to find ways it's going to look like a container process, but when it actually runs, it's going to be in some super controlled memory area of the CPU that's maybe bound by a hypervisor. And so I think we'll see tons of sort of explosion in that space that may take us in new directions about, how containers look or how we package them. So yeah, I'm not always great with the crystal ball, but I think, those are the areas where I see some interesting, people moving in new directions that, may radically change like how we think about running at least certain types of applications.
Yeah, I was talking with some people about at KubeCon about running kind of containers in WASM, and in particular, there's a new, I don't know if you're familiar with Silverblue, but
Yep.
So, but there's a new flavor of Silverblue called Bluefin, which is targeted at developers,
Right.
which is actually distributed as a container, which then you would like install on your laptop or whatever. But what's interesting there is, what if you could run Bluefin in a WASM browser, right?
Okay.
And so, like for my students, for example, that'd be really, really interesting, because then I could have a class where I can kind of give them a uniform development environment. that is based on Linux, right? But
Yeah.
still running in their browser. So there's going to be some interesting experimentation there. So yeah, I think that's I would agree with your crystal ball. There's a lot going on there, and it's really quite interesting. However, what I did want to also ask is, because the way we actually do this show, we normally say, okay, what do you see in the next 6 months, related to the kind of the projects you're involved with, or the next release, or whatever, do you think that you're most excited about, that you think is going to be the best new thing?
Yeah. So I said this earlier, Containerd is not maybe the most exciting project, but obviously for us and for people that are involved, like this 2.0 milestone is huge. As far as one of the most important things we've sort of put on ourselves in the last few years is there's a core to Containerd that we feel and clearly has been very valuable, but we want to make sure that everything else is very pluggable. So, the way you can plug in other snapshotters for other file system types, or like the WASM folks did, plugging in a different kind of shim to drive a different kind of workload. So 2.0 continues to move us to that world where we're trying to be extremely pluggable, and Containerd can be shaped by other use cases that maybe we haven't even predicted yet. And so that's again not exciting from a hey, here's a new AI feature. It's more exciting from an infrastructure standpoint of Containerd can hopefully be useful to a lot of different groups without them having to come to us and say, hey, Containerd doesn't work for me. I need this huge change. Instead, it's like, well, here's a plug point. Here's a way that you can add your capabilities. So yeah, that's exciting for us, and I think for the project in general. Getting to this 2.0 milestone is a big part of the maturity of the project. So yeah.
When you release it, you should consider, as part of the press release, showing a demo of plugging an LLM into one of those plug-in points. And,
yes,
and that'll blow up the release for a lot of people. Questionable value at best, I'm sure, but that would be the idea. Savita, did you have any kind of closing questions or thoughts that you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to say that it was so captivating to talk about the container stuff in OCI. I learned a lot. I almost forgot about AI until Phil brought it up. I know it is the top question that it's there on everyone's head. Wherever you go, especially at KubeCon or anywhere, any product that you use or build, people are like, how can I do AI with it? I totally forgot about that. I came today and I did not have that. It was such an interesting conversation to have. For me personally, I learned a lot. I'm even looking at Bluefoot. I've only seen the logo. It's a dinosaur and I really liked it. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to check it out. So it's been a very, it's a learning episode for myself at least.
Awesome.
So thank you for that.
Awesome. Yeah. And speaking of milestones, apparently our 10,000 PR was created in the last hour, and just one of our reviewers, she it's not a PR we'll be merging, but it's hilarious. It's just has made it to 10,000.
I just posted it to the chat. That is pretty awesome. I will say one of the things that I thought was interesting potentially for you is I've had more students talking to me about getting involved in systems in the past, 2 to 3 months than I ever have before. And I kind of wonder how much of it's related to defensiveness, in the sense of, there have been a lot of, issues with hiring and jobs and, layoffs and things like that. And so I wonder if you're going to see actually kind of an influx in contributors to things like Containerd or the Linux kernel, or, kind of the much more lower level infrastructure, because it is so kind of unusual for people to work on. And so I just kind of something to keep an eye out for, because I think it's potentially interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because every time And maybe this is just my own lack of faith that people still care about, the lower layers of the stack, when there's so much interesting happening, at higher layers. But, when we get new contributors and people show up and want to work on Containerd, it's like, awesome. Well, we'd love to have you. And, when we go to KubeCon and we have our maintainer track session, the room was packed and they had to turn away people at the door. And it's like, wow, like 7 years in, people still want to hear the latest on Containerd and figure out how to participate. And so that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really cool.
Well, thank you so much for the time. We really appreciate you coming on the show. And Savita points out there is a contributor or a contributing guide to Containerd that I will post in the chat real quick. But I think that's our show. And thank you so much for coming.
It was lovely chatting with you, Phil. I learned a lot, and thank you, Langdon.
Yeah.
It's one of the cool shows, at least. All episodes closer to heart, but this, since I'm on the show also, and I really thoroughly enjoyed learning about things today. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for having me. And it was a great conversation.
All right.
See ya.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.